It was the first chilly Monday of October in Lakeview, Oregon, a town mostly known for its quiet pine-covered hills and an old Jewish day school that had stood for nearly a century. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where neighbors shared leftover brisket on weekends and talked about their children like they were destined for greatness. It was a morning like any other. The streets were damp from the previous night's rain, and fog clung low to the roads as parents walked their kids into school with travel mugs in hand and scarves wrapped around their necks. Among those parents was Miriam Levin, who had just dropped off her two sons, Eli and Asher, at Beth Hatikvah School. Eli was 13 and precociously serious, while Asher was 11 and always trailed a step behind his older brother, full of questions and boundless curiosity. Miriam had watched them disappear into the old brick building, backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, unaware that it would be the last time she saw them walk through those doors. Beth Hatikvah was known for its strict discipline and small class sizes, a place where Jewish traditions were deeply embedded into everyday learning. The headmaster, Rabbi Hirsch, was a stern man with a slow voice and a heavy gaze, always reminding parents that the school did not only educate minds but shaped characters. That morning, the school was hosting its monthly emergency drill, a standard procedure, supposedly. But at 10:42 a.m., the alarm blared unexpectedly loud, jolting students from classrooms and staff from break rooms. Teachers corralled students out into the rear parking lot while the front gate remained locked. Parents were notified within minutes, told it was just a precautionary measure. 25 minutes later, as students were being accounted for, one teacher noticed that Eli and Asher Levin were missing. Their classroom had been cleared, their names not checked off on any list. Panic rose first in whispers, then in sharp exchanges between staff. Calls were made. The school was searched top to bottom. Bathrooms, closets, the library, even the locked storage behind the gym. Nothing. The boys were gone. By 12:30 p.m., the police had arrived. Miriam had been called around 11:15, told only that there was a situation involving her sons. She had driven back in a haze, her heart refusing to accept the dread that spread through her chest like wildfire. When she reached the school, the parking lot was a grid of police cars and parents murmuring with furrowed brows. She ran toward the yellow tape and the waiting officers, her voice breaking before she even got her first question out. Her sons had vanished during the drill, they said. Just vanished. Like a mistake in a magic trick. No one saw them leave. No one heard them scream. The school gates had been locked. Security footage, when reviewed, showed nothing unusual, until one grainy angle caught the tail end of something strange. The side gate to the faculty parking area had been left slightly ajar. And though the footage was blurry and gray-toned, a shadow could be seen slipping through just as the drill began. Only one shadow. No faces. No context. Police spread out across the nearby lake and its narrow walking trails. The area behind the school was thick with trees and moss-covered stones, sloping down to Lake Whitmore, a deep, still lake said to be bottomless by some of the older residents. Search teams scoured every possible path, calling out the boys' names until sunset fell and the trees swallowed sound like a grave. That night, search dogs were brought in. Divers, too. But nothing turned up. No footprints. No disturbed branches. No dropped backpacks. Back at home, Miriam and her husband, David, sat in their living room in silence. The boys' rooms remained untouched. Half-folded laundry lay on their beds. A half-eaten apple sat on the kitchen counter. It was like time had been frozen, brutally, and without reason. Police canvassed the neighborhood, knocked on doors, questioned everyone. But in the small town of Lakeview, people noticed when something strange happened, and this was beyond strange. This was impossible. On the second day, volunteers joined the search. The community rallied behind the Levins, baking food, offering prayers, and sticking flyers on every lamppost within 20 miles. Rabbi Hirsch held a special service at the synagogue, and half the town showed up, though no one said what everyone was thinking. That maybe the boys had been taken. Or worse. On the third day, Asher's backpack was found. It had been floating near the south edge of Lake Whitmore, its straps tangled in reeds. Inside was his geography book, a crushed granola bar, and a small plastic toy soldier he always carried. There were no signs of damage. No blood. No waterlogging. It was as if someone had placed it there gently, deliberately. The police shifted focus. They brought in forensic experts from Portland. The backpack was dusted and swabbed, but the results would take weeks. Still, the town kept searching. Miriam barely slept, her mind looping through every possible scenario like a haunting film reel. She replayed the morning endlessly. Had Eli said something unusual? Had Asher been nervous? Had she missed something? By the 5th day, suspicion turned inward. Questions swirled about the school staff. Why was that gate open? Who had the keys? Then came the revelation that stunned everyone. One of the teachers, Mr. Stein, had quit the day after the boys went missing. He had packed up, left town, and hadn't been heard from since. He had claimed a family emergency, but the timing was too close. Too wrong. When police tracked his last known whereabouts, they found he had used a bus ticket purchased in cash. He'd left no forwarding address. By the 7th day, Beth Hatikvah shut down indefinitely. Parents pulled their children from the school, unable to bear the thought of another child vanishing without a trace. The halls of the old building fell silent, and the brick facade became a grim monument to absence. On the 10th day, the search officially transitioned from rescue to recovery. But Miriam refused to believe her sons were gone. There were no bodies, no answers, just a growing, echoing hole where her children used to be. Miriam Levin did not sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time during the first week. Her body moved through the motions of living, but her mind remained trapped in that singular loop, the image of her sons walking through the school gate on Monday morning, the backpacks bouncing, Asher's shoes untied, Eli adjusting his yarmulke as he turned to wave. That memory played in her head like an unending projection in a dark theater, growing louder with every quiet hour that passed. By the end of the week, their home had transformed into a command center. The kitchen table was buried under maps, police reports, lists of volunteers, and printed timelines. David, a quiet man who usually solved problems by retreating into his work as a software analyst, had quit his job that Friday without telling anyone. His eyes were red and glassy, his speech clipped, as if saving energy for a longer war. On Saturday morning, Miriam walked out to the edge of Lake Whitmore alone. She stood where the reeds had caught Asher's backpack and stared at the water's surface. The lake gave nothing back. No ripple, no glimmer, no answer. She stepped closer until the hem of her jeans met the damp soil and whispered her sons' names as if the lake might return them. By Sunday, the police presence had dwindled. The lead investigator, Detective Rana, met with the Levins privately to explain that while the case remained open, resource constraints meant they could no longer dedicate full-time personnel. She assured them that tips would still be followed, and forensic testing on the backpack was ongoing. Miriam nodded, but her heart sank. The unspoken truth hung between them. Without new leads, this case was entering the cold shadow that swallowed so many others. Miriam would not let that happen. That evening, as the sun set in a smear of pink over the rooftops of Lakeview, David reopened his laptop for the first time since the boys vanished. Not for work, but for something else. He began building a digital archive, a repository of every piece of information they had. Police transcripts, school records, neighborhood security footage, weather data, a GPS map of search zones. He organized it meticulously, naming files by date and relevance. Miriam watched him from the hallway and said nothing. She simply stepped into the boys' room, sat on Eli's bed, and began reading his journal aloud to herself. It was filled with drawings of robots and notes on Hebrew grammar, a child's voice immortalized in pencil. Monday marked 8 days. That morning, Miriam received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed the side gate of Beth Hatikvah, taken from across the street at a high angle. The gate was slightly ajar, just like in the security footage. But in this version, barely visible in the upper corner, was the shoulder of a man. The photograph had no timestamp, no note, no fingerprints. Miriam brought it to Detective Rana immediately, who sent it to the lab. But it would take time. Time was the one thing Miriam felt slipping through her hands like water. 2 days later, the headmaster, Rabbi Hirsch, announced he would be taking a leave of absence. The announcement came by email, buried in school system updates. He offered no explanation, only a single paragraph expressing heartbreak and prayers for the safe return of Eli and Asher. Miriam read it 3 times, then printed it and added it to David's archive. She felt something shift then, an instinct she could not explain. She began calling every parent she remembered from class volunteer days, gathering fragments. She asked what their children remembered about Mr. Stein, the teacher who had vanished the day after her sons. Most replied vaguely, recalling that he taught religious studies and rarely smiled. One parent, however, hesitated before saying her daughter once mentioned Mr. Stein had keys to more than just the classrooms. He was trusted, apparently, to lock up the building at night. That detail pulled something tight in Miriam's chest. She revisited the school blueprints David had scanned into his database. They had obtained them from a public records request. On the lower left corner, marked in faded pencil, was a room she had overlooked before. Room 1B storage. It was situated behind the gymnasium, part of the old wing built in the 60s. According to the blueprints, the room had two entrances. One from the main hallway, another from outside. When she mentioned this to Detective Rana, the detective confirmed they had searched the room but not the crawlspace beneath it, which had been sealed shut years ago due to mold issues. The next day, Miriam asked to be taken there. She and David stood in the long corridor of the abandoned wing, paint peeling from the ceiling, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The officer accompanying them unlocked the storage room with an old key recovered from the school archives. Dust hung in the air as the door opened. Inside, boxes of outdated textbooks and broken desks filled the space. In the back corner, beneath a sagging tarp, was a hatch, padlocked. When the officer cut it open and lifted the door, a breath of stale, cold air rose up. The crawl space stretched far beneath the floor, low and narrow. A technician lowered a camera down on a cable. The screen flickered, showing cobwebs, dirt, and old pipes. Then something caught the light. A scuff mark on the concrete. It curved in a crescent, like a shoe print. Two shoe prints, parallel, children's size. And beside them, a strip of fabric, red and frayed. Asher's favorite hoodie had been red. That night, the Levins did not speak. They simply sat on the couch, side by side, staring at the paused frame from the camera feed. The image was grainy, but the implication was clear. Eli and Asher had been in that crawl space. Possibly hidden there. Possibly moved. It reopened the question Miriam had feared to ask aloud. Had someone in the school helped them disappear? Had someone used the chaos of the drill to move them? Or had they been taken days before and the drill orchestrated to cover up the gap? Miriam remembered Asher's last words before school that day. He had been nervous. He said he did not want to go. She had told him he was just tired. Now she realized it was fear, not fatigue, and she had missed it. On the morning of the 12th day since Eli and Asher disappeared, Miriam Levin stood in the garage surrounded by boxes filled with photo albums, school forms, and her son's art projects from kindergarten. The air was cold and stale, and the fluorescent light flickered above her as if hesitating to help her see. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the layers of childhood memories, searching not for nostalgia but for evidence. She was not exactly sure what she hoped to find, only that she needed to keep searching. Outside, the world had already begun to move on. The initial swarm of reporters had left. The search parties had thinned. The school gates were locked. No new updates were posted by the police. Even the community, once so galvanized, had begun to return to the rhythm of daily life. Only Miriam and David remained in a state of suspended time. They functioned with mechanical purpose, barely eating, rarely speaking unless necessary. Focused solely on the expanding digital archive David updated nightly with timestamps and metadata and files that had names like folder_gym_footage_edited or Asher_last_known_location. Despite their best efforts, no one had come forward with new information. The photograph showing the partially open gate remained unclaimed. The shadowed figure near the fence could not be identified. When the police ran facial recognition software on archived school photos to match it, the results were inconclusive. There was no certainty, only suspicion. David had taken to waking before dawn, walking around the lake with his old camera, snapping photos of paths and trails from different angles, hoping something might reveal itself. He had stopped shaving, and his face had grown hollow, older. Miriam feared that the silence of the house was slowly carving him out from the inside. One night, she found him sitting in the boys' shared closet, just staring at their jackets. His fingers brushed the lining of Eli's winter coat as though trying to memorize it. She joined him without a word, simply resting her head on his shoulder as they sat there, surrounded by the familiar smell of fabric softener and plastic toys, both wishing they could reverse time. Detective Rana continued to check in once every 3 days, but her tone had shifted from urgent to courteous. It was the kind of politeness that Miriam recognized instantly, the type reserved for situations already labeled unsolvable. The detective assured them that the backpack was still undergoing DNA analysis and that the fabric retrieved from the crawl space had been sent to a forensic lab for comparison. But weeks passed, and no results returned. Each time Miriam called, she was told there were delays. Processing times were slow. The backlog was heavy. She felt her heart grow heavier with every unanswered phone call. One afternoon in late October, Miriam received a call from a parent at Beth Hatikvah. The woman, Rebecca Klein, had a daughter in the same grade as Eli. She mentioned something that had gone unreported during the initial wave of interviews. Her daughter had once overheard Mr. Stein talking to another teacher about after-school tutoring sessions for students who were falling behind. The odd thing was that Eli was never behind in anything. He was top of his class, especially in Hebrew studies. Miriam thanked her and noted the detail. She began scanning through emails, report cards, any sign that Eli had been registered for after-school activities. There was nothing official, but she found a printed flyer buried at the bottom of the mail basket in the kitchen. It had been crumpled and left behind as if forgotten. It promoted a special history tutoring program starting the month before the boys vanished, open only to male students in grades 6 through 8. The contact email listed belonged to Mr. Stein. She brought the flyer to Detective Rana, who frowned and made a note. But again, no action followed. Miriam and David felt themselves slipping out of the narrative. Media outlets no longer covered the story. Their sons' faces were no longer shown on local news. The only people still asking questions were the ones who had already lost something. Miriam became more determined. She drove to the district office herself and requested access to staff records. After persistent demands and threats of legal escalation, she was granted a brief look at archived personnel files under supervision. She found something strange in Mr. Stein's file. His original reference letter was signed by a Rabbi Gelman in New Jersey, but the synagogue listed no longer existed. It had closed 5 years earlier after a fire. There was no trace of Stein's employment prior to Beth Hatikvah. No linked certifications. No credentials verifiable online. His resume was a ghost. When she brought this to the attention of Detective Rana, the response was careful. They would look into it. But no follow-up came. At home, Miriam and David began to suspect that something deeper had gone unreported, a failure not just of individual memory but of systemic oversight. How had a teacher been hired without verified credentials? How had he obtained full building access? Why had no one questioned his resignation immediately following the disappearance? They posed these questions in emails to the school board, to the Regional Department of Education, to anyone who might be held accountable. Most messages were ignored. A few replied with templated condolences and vague acknowledgments of concern. Only one email, signed anonymously, said to look into the renovation permits filed the year before. That led David down another rabbit hole. He discovered that in the spring before Eli and Asher vanished, the school had quietly requested and received permission to renovate the basement level beneath the gymnasium. According to the paperwork, they had constructed reinforced storage spaces for old equipment and sealed off old tunnels that had once been used as service corridors when the building was first erected. The plans included no photographs, no inspection follow-up reports. When David asked for visual confirmation, the district replied that all access to the gymnasium had been suspended pending insurance review. That night, Miriam stood in the hallway, staring at a framed photo of the boys at their last birthday party. She reached up, removed the frame, and turned it over. Behind the photo was a note that Asher had taped there months earlier. It was meant as a joke. It said, "Secret message: if you find this, you get a prize." She ran her fingers over the ink, over the messy handwriting, and her throat closed. They began to understand that the truth, whatever it was, had been buried deeper than they had imagined. Not just beneath the floorboards, not just in sealed crawl spaces, but beneath layers of bureaucratic neglect and institutional decay. The town that had once surrounded them with warmth now met their continued grief with avoidance. People crossed the street to avoid conversation. Former friends became distant. It was not out of malice, but out of fear. They feared that the Levins' grief might be contagious, that to get too close was to become involved in something too vast, too haunting to confront. But Miriam refused to retreat. She began reaching out beyond Lakeview. She joined forums for families of missing children. She shared the story with bloggers and independent journalists. She sent files from David's archive to true crime researchers and investigative podcasters. One of them responded. A man named Jonah Grady, known for digging into cold cases with unorthodox methods, agreed to meet. He arrived 2 weeks later with a small camera crew and questions more pointed than any the police had asked. He was particularly interested in the basement renovations and the sudden disappearance of staff records. He said what Miriam had not dared say aloud, that someone had designed this disappearance, and they had done so with time and access and help. Help from inside. It had been 11 years since the morning Eli and Asher Levin walked through the front doors of Beth Hatikvah and never returned. The world had changed in 1,000 subtle ways during that time, and yet for Miriam Levin, time itself had not moved at all. She still lived in the same house on Willowbend Street, still kept the boys' rooms exactly as they had left them, still drank the same brand of weak tea each morning while reading through old notes and files and messages. David had eventually gone back to part-time consulting, more out of necessity than healing, but he remained quiet and distant, a man who had accepted the permanent disfigurement of his life without ever quite speaking it aloud. The house had grown quieter over the years, more faded, as if the paint itself had learned to whisper. The only difference was the presence of the archive, now expanded into an entire room where David had built a system of shelves, boxes, and digital backups that documented every shred of evidence they had ever touched. 11 years was enough time to watch children grow into adults, enough time to rebuild after loss, to accept, to forgive, but Miriam had done none of those things. She had not given up and she had not moved on. She had simply learned to endure. On the anniversary of the disappearance, Miriam placed fresh stones on the memorial bench erected near Lake Whitmore and returned home to find an envelope wedged into her mailbox. It was unmarked, sealed in plain paper. Inside was a single photograph, glossy and recent. It showed a man standing by a weathered sign that read Hatikvah Storage Facility, a place Miriam did not recognize. The man wore dark sunglasses and stood with his back slightly turned, but something about the shape of his shoulder, the way his arm hung stiffly, made Miriam's stomach twist. She took the photo inside and placed it on the desk next to the digital scanner. David joined her silently, eyes narrowing as he studied the image. He ran a quick reverse image search and came up with nothing. The facility name was not listed anywhere in the state records. It did not appear on Google Maps. It did not exist officially. Miriam called Jonah Grady, the independent podcaster who had covered their story 7 years earlier, and asked if he had ever heard of it. He had not, but he promised to look into it. 2 days later, Jonah called back with a location. The facility was real but registered under a different name, a dummy corporation that managed inactive properties once used for municipal storage. It was located just 15 miles outside of Lakeview, deep in the forest near an old quarry that had been closed since the late 90s. Jonah offered to drive out there with his crew and take a look. Miriam insisted on going with him. The next morning, they arrived at the site just after dawn. The road was narrow and cracked, bordered by trees that seemed to lean inward like guardians of a forgotten place. The facility was surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. The sign on the front, faded and bent, read Langford Materials Depot. The building itself was a squat gray rectangle with boarded windows and a steel double door. It looked abandoned, but something about the place felt wrong. Too maintained. The gravel showed tire tracks. The lock on the gate was new. Jonah and Miriam stood in silence as they took it in. One of Jonah's crew members flew a small drone overhead, capturing footage of the roof and surrounding area. They found a back entrance with an electronic keypad, but no code. Jonah made a call to a contact who specialized in security bypasses and asked him to meet them later that afternoon. While they waited, Miriam walked the perimeter. Behind the building was a patch of dirt where something had recently been dug up and refilled. The soil was loose and uneven. She crouched down, ran her fingers through the dirt, and felt something hard beneath the surface. She called for Jonah, who brought a small trowel from the equipment bag. Together, they unearthed a weathered metal box. Inside was a collection of old photos, each of them faded but instantly recognizable. They were photos of children, boys in school uniforms. Some of the faces were familiar, others were not. But Miriam recognized Eli in one of them, standing in the far back, his arm around Asher's shoulder. The background was unfamiliar. A room with gray walls and a long table. On the table were books, papers, a single plastic cup. Miriam's hands shook as she held the photo closer. Eli looked older than he had on the day he disappeared, maybe a year or two older. She handed it to Jonah, who stared in stunned silence. They took the box back to the car just as the technician arrived to access the keypad. He worked quickly, inserting a device that bypassed the lock within minutes. The door opened with a groan. The inside of the facility was dark, dusty, and filled with metal shelving. Many of the shelves were empty. Some held boxes labeled with strange codes and dates. In the far corner, behind a false wall of sheet metal, they found a door that led to a stairwell. It descended 3 flights down into a sub-basement that was not on any blueprint. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were concrete, stained with water and mold. At the bottom was a corridor lined with doors, each numbered, each locked. They opened the first one using the same bypass tool. Inside was a room with a single metal bed, a desk, and a small vent. The floor was concrete. The ceiling was low. On the desk sat a notebook, open to a page with a familiar handwriting. David would later confirm it was Eli's. The note was brief. It said that someone had come to move them, that they were not alone, that they had to follow instructions or else they would be split apart. The page ended abruptly. No signature. No date. Miriam sat down on the edge of the bed, heart pounding in her chest, a deep ache rising from her stomach to her throat. The silence in that room pressed against her ears like water. She imagined Eli sitting in that very spot, writing in fear, trying to leave behind a signal. Jonah placed a hand on her shoulder, but said nothing. They opened 2 more rooms. Each was the same. Bed, desk, vent. Some had scraps of paper. Some had nothing. The facility had not been used in years, but at one point, someone had lived there. Children had lived there. Perhaps many. They photographed everything. Packed every item. Contacted law enforcement anonymously. Miriam and Jonah agreed not to involve the local department. Too many unanswered questions. Too much time lost. They contacted a federal agent who Jonah had worked with on a prior case. The agent agreed to open a quiet inquiry. Miriam returned home that evening carrying the photo of her sons in a trembling hand. 3 days after Miriam and Jonah uncovered the underground facility, a quiet current of urgency rippled through the silence that had long surrounded the case. Miriam sat at the dining table with the photo of Eli and Asher placed gently in front of her, beside the metal box of faded images and the notebook pages retrieved from the sublevel rooms. Her fingers hovered over the edges of the photo as if touching it too firmly might cause it to vanish. David had spent the past 48 hours scanning and analyzing every item they recovered from the storage facility, cross-referencing dates and visual cues in the background of each image. He enlarged the background wall in one of the group photos, enhancing the grainy shape of a wall calendar just enough to make out the month. It read March. The year was more difficult to identify, but through a process of digital elimination and matching calendar templates, David was able to determine that the layout aligned with March of the year following the boys' disappearance. This meant Eli and Asher had still been alive months after everyone else believed they had perished or been taken far away. They had been kept, hidden, managed. That word echoed in Miriam's mind with growing dread. Managed. As if her sons were not human children, but items on a shelf, subjects in an experiment, or variables in a program. Jonah contacted his federal contact again, sending over the enhanced photos and notebook samples. The agent agreed to send a forensic team to the site under the radar. He stressed the need for caution. If the facility had been recently disturbed, there was a chance whoever was behind it might still be active or nearby. Miriam felt the same knot tighten in her chest, the one that had never really loosened in over a decade. She had always believed her sons had not simply vanished, that they had been hidden with intention, and now that belief had transformed into horrifying clarity. The federal team arrived at dawn under the guise of a regional environmental inspection unit. They moved quickly, securing the perimeter and collecting every piece of evidence. Miriam was not allowed inside during the sweep, but Jonah remained close, updating her with what he learned. The agents found trace DNA in 2 of the rooms, including hair samples that were being expedited to a private lab for comparison. They also found signs that the facility had been used within the past year. A discarded food wrapper, an active security battery, and the most damning clue of all, a recently replaced section of wiring connected to an internal camera feed. Someone had been watching, recording, perhaps even monitoring activity long after the boys were presumed dead. A second team scoured the area around the facility, uncovering a buried generator shed and a thin fiber cable leading into the forest, where it disappeared beneath the roots of heavy trees. Miriam stood outside the building in the cold air, listening to the wind rustle the dry branches above and wondering if her sons had ever stood in the same place, breathing this same air, waiting to be found. As the investigation moved forward quietly, Miriam focused on one detail she could not let go of: the lake. Lake Whitmore had always been the central image in the mystery. Asher's backpack had been found there. The final known location of the boys had been near the edge of the water. Everyone had assumed they had been taken away from the lake, but what if they had been taken through it? She remembered the story one of the divers had once told during the initial search effort. He had blacked out while diving, disoriented by a sudden shift in current. It had seemed inconsequential at the time, attributed to stress or fatigue, but now it seemed deliberate. Jonah brought in a specialist named Dr. Avery Kerr, a hydrologist familiar with old dam systems and geological surveys. She examined maps of the lakebed and noted a strange anomaly at the southern point, where a man-made trench had once fed into a forgotten drainage system. The system had been decommissioned decades earlier, yet it remained listed in the city's oldest infrastructure blueprints. The trench led to an access tunnel buried deep below the lake's surface, lined with concrete and wide enough to allow passage for small vessels or equipment. If the boys had been moved that way, it would explain the absence of tracks and the strategic placement of the backpack. Dr. Kerr confirmed that the tunnel could still be accessed by skilled divers, but it would require precise coordination and specialized gear. Miriam gave her consent immediately. Jonah arranged for 2 expert divers to arrive within 72 hours. The operation would be risky. The tunnel had not been accessed in over 40 years. No one knew its structural integrity, and the likelihood of collapse was significant. But the chance to find more answers, even after 11 years, could not be ignored. When the divers descended into Lake Whitmore that morning, the fog had thickened, blurring the trees into shadowed silhouettes and muting the world into silence. Miriam stood at the edge of the dock wrapped in her oldest coat, the one she had worn the day after the boys disappeared, the fabric still holding the scent of time and memory. She watched the bubbles rise and waited. Jonah stood beside her with his camera equipment off, his presence steady and silent. 37 minutes passed before the first diver resurfaced. His voice trembled with excitement and disbelief. They had found something. At the end of the tunnel, lodged in a collapsed portion of concrete wall, they discovered a waterproof crate sealed with industrial clasps. It had no identifying marks on the exterior. The crate was carefully brought to shore, examined under the supervision of the agents, and opened in a controlled setting. Inside were objects that made Miriam's knees buckle. A small pair of shoes, neatly stacked. A journal with Eli's initials carved into the corner. A flashlight with a partially drained battery. A photograph, preserved in plastic, showing Eli and Asher standing in front of a chalkboard, both boys holding up signs with numbers. The numbers were not dates or identifiers. They appeared to be a code. Jonah and David began analyzing the symbols immediately. David recognized a pattern that matched a sequence used in Hebrew gematria, a system that assigned numerical values to letters. The numbers translated to a phrase. It read, "We are not alone. We wait." The crate recovered from the submerged tunnel beneath Lake Whitmore remained at the center of a sealed evidence facility for several days before federal technicians completed their initial examinations. Every object inside was meticulously cataloged, photographed, and swabbed for trace elements. Miriam was not permitted to touch the contents directly, but she was invited to observe through a viewing window alongside Jonah and David. When the technician gently opened the journal believed to belong to Eli, the room fell into absolute stillness. The first few pages were blank, water-streaked and curled at the edges from years of humidity despite the waterproof container. But beyond them were legible entries written in Eli's unmistakable handwriting. The entries were short, written in a tone far beyond his age, laced with a quiet precision that made Miriam's chest ache. The first entry described their arrival into what he referred to as the lower halls. Eli noted that there were other children already there, none of whom spoke above a whisper, and that the adults wore uniforms without names or badges. He mentioned Asher often, describing how he clung to him at night, how they shared a narrow bed and shifts with another boy named Micah who barely spoke. The journal revealed the presence of routines, scheduled times for eating and writing, and structured hours when they were brought into a different space Eli called the White Room, where questions were asked and lights were bright and cold. Eli's final entries shifted in tone, growing fragmented. There were sketches of symbols, maps of corridors, even phrases in Hebrew that translated into concepts like silence is safety and do not look directly. The last complete entry was a single line written across the bottom of a torn page. It read, "If we go, We go through the lake again. David leaned against the glass, his knuckles white, as the technician carefully closed the journal and moved onto the small shoes, confirming their match with a pair from an old photo of Asher at a school assembly. A forensic specialist confirmed that the shoes contained DNA consistent with both brothers. Alongside these items were several folded pages with structured forms, each bearing printed labels and empty boxes for names, dates, and annotations. Some were filled out. Others were not. But the forms were not school documents. They were printed on thick gray stock with no institutional logos. The language used was clinical, describing behavioral responses, conditioning phases, and exposure to stimuli. Jonah took photos through the glass and quickly sent them to a contact in behavioral psychology. The forms, his contact later confirmed, were similar to those used in experimental settings designed to monitor and influence behavior in enclosed populations. The suggestion was clear and horrifying. Eli and Asher had not merely been hidden. They had been part of something designed, monitored, and maintained. Miriam could not sleep that night. She wandered the house aimlessly, stopping in front of each framed photo on the walls, running her fingertips over glass as if trying to connect through time. She thought of Eli scribbling inside a locked room, whispering instructions to Asher in the dark, choosing each word in his journal with the weight of survival pressing against his young hands. In the morning, she called Jonah and asked him to return to the lake with her. They stood on the dock, the water still and gray beneath a heavy sky. Miriam stared into its depths and wondered how many others had been moved through its silent corridors. Jonah suggested revisiting the other evidence recovered from the hidden facility. He believed there was more buried there, possibly sealed away behind reinforced walls or beneath floor panels. The federal team allowed them a second visit under controlled conditions. This time, they brought specialized scanning equipment, including a ground-penetrating radar unit and a thermal camera capable of detecting cold spots behind insulation. As the scanner passed over the floor of one of the sublevel rooms, it revealed a hollow space beneath the concrete. The technicians carefully removed a section of flooring and discovered a rusted metal hatch, sealed with bolts. It took several hours to cut through the bolts without destabilizing the surrounding structure. When the hatch finally opened, a narrow shaft descended into what appeared to be an even deeper level, unknown to any of the original facility plans. The air that rose from it was colder than the rest of the building, tinged with mildew and dust. Jonah lowered a camera on a tether, the feed broadcasting onto a monitor nearby. The shaft opened into a chamber filled with storage trunks, identical in size and color, lined up in a precise grid pattern. The trunks were marked with numbers rather than names, each with an index card tucked into a slot on the lid. 3 of the trunks were brought up and opened in succession. Each contained bundles of clothing, photographs, small toys, and documents. The items were too varied to belong to a single child. It appeared that each trunk held the belongings of multiple individuals. One trunk included a school ID card from a private institution in Vermont. Another contained a Hebrew prayer book with a child's name etched into the front cover. None of the names matched anyone currently listed in missing persons databases. Miriam realized with a sickening clarity that the system had been wider than she ever imagined. The lake had not been a singular passage. The facility had not been a singular location. And Eli and Asher had not been the only ones. The team cataloged every trunk and cross-referenced the items with school records from across the region. The process would take months. In the meantime, Jonah published a private report shared only with law enforcement and selected journalists. He avoided publishing it publicly out of fear that it might jeopardize ongoing operations. Miriam supported his decision, even as part of her long to scream the truth into the sky. The final object found in the shaft stopped them all cold. It was a framed photograph, buried beneath the bottom layer of one trunk. It showed a group of 7 children standing in front of a black wall. Behind them was a symbol, unfamiliar and geometric, etched in chalk. 2 of the children were Eli and Asher. The others were unknown. One girl stood to the side, her eyes looking off camera, her face partially obscured. A date was written in the bottom corner. It was 14 months after the day her sons had vanished. The discovery of the underground chamber beneath the sublevel rooms of the hidden facility confirmed Miriam's deepest fear, that the disappearance of her sons was only one thread in a much larger, tightly woven fabric of control and secrecy. The framed photograph showing Eli and Asher alongside 5 other children in front of a chalk wall etched with an unfamiliar symbol became the central artifact in the next phase of the investigation. Jonah scanned and enhanced the image, noting that the geometric symbol behind the children bore similarities to obscure religious iconography, but it did not match anything in known Jewish or esoteric traditions. He sent the image to contacts in cultural anthropology, symbology, and comparative religion, but the results returned no matches, only speculation. Miriam focused instead on the children in the photo. She printed multiple copies and began comparing them with missing persons databases, private school yearbooks, and archived community newsletters from across the region. Late one evening, she recognized a familiar face among the unidentified children in the photo. It was the same girl who had briefly attended Beth Hatikvah 2 months before Eli and Asher disappeared, a girl named Leah Kaplan, who had transferred out suddenly after only 3 weeks. Miriam remembered her vividly now, not because of her time at school, but because of the day her mother had arrived to withdraw her. The woman had appeared frantic and reluctant, speaking quietly with the school secretary and leaving without saying goodbye to anyone. Miriam had never questioned it then. Now she understood it differently. She contacted the Kaplan family, whose last known address had been a small townhouse in southern Oregon. The property was now vacant, the family long since relocated. But after hours of searching, Jonah located a cousin still living nearby. Through her, they arranged a call with Leah, now in her 20s and living under a different surname in Idaho. Leah hesitated at first, but eventually agreed to meet in person. The meeting took place in a quiet hotel lobby on the outskirts of Boise. Miriam and Jonah sat with Leah for 2 hours as she slowly unfolded her story, her voice trembling as she recounted memories that had long haunted her dreams. She confirmed that the photo was real. She had been there. She remembered the black wall, the bright light, and the strange questions asked during sessions in the White Room. She remembered Eli and Asher. She remembered how Eli would speak calmly to his younger brother, how he always tried to protect him, how he taught the others songs in Hebrew to help pass the time. Leah explained that she had been taken to the facility after a series of behavioral incidents at her old school, told it was a place for special students, a program to help children with unique abilities and sensitivity. She said the adults there used codes instead of names and never showed their faces clearly. The children were not physically harmed, but they were isolated, subjected to routines and psychological tests, and punished for speaking out of turn or asking questions. What shocked Miriam most was Leah's recollection of being moved one night through a tunnel system she later realized led toward the lake. She said not all children were moved. Some remained. Some vanished quietly. She had been released after her mother intervened and agreed to sign a series of non-disclosure agreements in exchange for Leah's release. Her mother told her never to speak of the place again. Leah had not, until now. She agreed to testify anonymously and provided a sworn affidavit detailing everything she remembered. Her testimony gave the federal team the foundation they needed to reopen the investigation under a new classification. What had once been treated as a missing persons case was now officially being investigated as a multi-jurisdictional operation involving unlawful confinement, abuse of minors, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The news of this reclassification was not made public. The operation remained quiet, strategic. Miriam understood the need for discretion, but every moment of waiting pulled at her nerves. Her sons had been part of something constructed with intention and precision. Someone had created the environment they lived in. Someone had monitored them. Someone had allowed them to be taken and then erased every trace of their existence. She returned to the facility site with the federal team, this time to inspect the symbols carved into the sublevel wall. One of the agents brought in a linguist who identified part of the symbol as a cipher, potentially derived from a combination of Hebrew letters and older, obscure dialects. When decoded, the symbols formed phrases that echoed Eli's journal. Words like silence and obedience and we are watched. The presence of a systematic language suggested not just a behavioral experiment but a doctrine, a belief system, an ideology. Miriam began to wonder who had founded this program, who had funded it. She asked the agent if any names had surfaced. He said only one, an obscure entity listed in the incorporation documents of the dummy corporation that owned the land. The name was the Leor Foundation. No public records linked the foundation to any legitimate charitable work. Its address was a P.O. box in Northern California. When the federal team traced financial transactions, they discovered a web of shell companies moving money through encrypted channels. Each transaction was just small enough to avoid triggering automated fraud detection. This was not the work of a rogue individual. It was an organization with reach, with resources, and with a clear plan. Jonah published a limited podcast episode for a select group of listeners, summarizing Leah's testimony and hinting at the larger conspiracy without naming specifics. He hoped it might prompt others to come forward. Within a week, 2 more families contacted them, each with stories of unexplained school removals, silent treatment from institutions, and children who returned home altered, afraid to speak. One of the families had a son who remembered Eli by name. He said Eli used to whisper plans at night, drawing maps in the dust beneath his bed, telling the others that they had to leave together or not at all. The boy said Eli believed there were watchers, not just staff but systems, machines built into the walls that tracked their breathing, their words, their dreams. Miriam cried when she heard that. Not because it confirmed her fears, but because it confirmed her son had fought. He had not been broken. He had resisted. She printed the boy's statement and placed it beside the last page of Eli's journal. Every new testimony added weight to the investigation. The federal team began expanding their search to other facilities owned by the Leor Foundation. Miriam reviewed maps, cross-checked property records, and pushed for further exploration of the lake tunnel system. David returned to the archive, organizing new data, backing up files, creating redundancies. They were no longer just searching for answers. They were preparing for exposure, the kind that could not be undone. As the federal investigation deepened and new testimonies surfaced, Miriam found herself no longer a bystander to her son's fate, but an active force within a growing movement of families, researchers, and investigators determined to expose what had remained hidden for over a decade. She joined weekly briefings with the federal team, attended secure virtual meetings with trauma psychologists, legal experts, and child welfare advocates who had seen patterns like this before in smaller, less coordinated forms. The more she learned, the more she realized that what had happened to Eli and Asher was not just a crime against 2 boys, but a systemic operation that had preyed on families across state lines, often through schools that catered to children deemed sensitive, gifted, or in need of alternative instruction. The term gifted had appeared too often in testimonies used by recruiters and facilitators as justification for removing children from traditional settings and placing them into so-called enhancement programs. The Leor Foundation operated in shadows, but its strategies were chillingly clear. Target vulnerable families, present a solution cloaked in academic opportunity, isolate children under the guise of improvement, and then erase the paper trail through misfiled records, expired addresses, and digital silence. Miriam asked Jonah to help her compile a full list of known and suspected properties once affiliated with the foundation. Using real estate shell transfers and zoning anomalies, they identified 9 locations across 5 states that matched the criteria. Some were decommissioned warehouses, others abandoned schools or research centers repurposed for ambiguous nonprofit work. One facility in Nevada had burned down 3 years earlier under suspicious circumstances. Another in Montana had been purchased by a church group with no clear doctrine or congregation. The most recent acquisition was a parcel of land near a reservoir in Northern California, registered under a wellness retreat that had never opened to the public. Miriam believed the lake system was critical. Waterways provided concealment, silent transport, and psychological boundaries. Survivors often mentioned dreams of drowning, echoing tunnels, the taste of minerals in the air. It was no coincidence that her sons had left their final message coded within a crate beneath the lake. The federal team organized a quiet operation to investigate the California property. Miriam and Jonah were not allowed to participate directly but were kept informed through limited updates. Satellite imagery showed several small buildings along the tree line and a single boathouse with an entrance facing the water. A thermal scan revealed intermittent heat signatures in the main structure. A private utility line fed power into the property, traced back to a third-party supplier located out of state. When agents breached the compound under the cover of night, they found a partially operational facility outfitted with beds, surveillance equipment, medical supplies, and personal belongings indicating recent use. No children were present, but DNA samples were collected, including traces matching at least one unidentified individual believed to be of similar age and profile as Eli. The operation recovered hard drives, encrypted devices, and a handwritten ledger containing dates and numeric codes. Among the names listed in shorthand was a variation that resembled E-Lev and ASH Lev written side by side with a red check mark beside them. The handwriting matched samples found in the first facility. This confirmed that whoever had managed the site had access to both locations and maintained continuity across years and regions. David dove into the recovered files, analyzing metadata and hidden logs. He discovered timestamps that corresponded with entries in Eli's journal and Leah's recollections, overlapping routines, light cycles, and identifiers for specific dormitory rooms. One file referenced relocation procedures, including guidelines for environmental adjustment, dietary normalization, and memory suppression. The term memory suppression sent a cold ripple through Miriam's spine. Until now, the suggestion had been that the children were controlled through isolation and manipulation, but this hinted at pharmacological or psychological methods that could fundamentally alter memory retention. If her sons had survived and been relocated again, they might not even remember who they were. The pain of this realization forced her to sit down, her breath caught somewhere between fear and determination. She would not let that be the final truth. She had to find them. Not just their bodies, not just their stories, but the boys themselves, whole and real, somewhere still waiting to be awakened. Jonah released a restricted episode of his podcast, using altered voices and anonymized data to describe the California site. Within 24 hours, a former employee of a behavioral research institute contacted him through a secure channel. The man claimed to have worked in a subcontracted facility in Colorado, part of a program focused on immersive developmental environments. He said he had been told the children involved were orphans from unstable countries, selected for their resilience and high adaptability. He had started asking questions after recognizing inconsistencies in language fluency and religious references among the children, particularly those who spoke fluent Hebrew and mentioned families back home. When he was reassigned suddenly and barred from accessing his own case notes, he left the organization but kept a copy of one internal video file. He sent it to Jonah, encrypted and password protected. The file showed a therapy session in a dimly lit room, timestamped nearly 8 years ago. The boy speaking had dark hair, thin shoulders, and a voice that trembled but did not break. His name was not given, but he referred to himself in third person once, calling himself Asher. He described a brother who told stories, who translated ancient prayers into English, who promised that one day they would return to the world together. Miriam watched the video on a loop for hours, memorizing the way the boy blinked, the curve of his mouth, the fear behind his composure. She knew it was him. Her son was alive at least 8 years ago, speaking through layers of trauma, still holding on to the bond with his brother. This revelation changed the urgency of the case. The federal team began coordinating with international organizations, suspecting that if relocation had occurred more than once, the boys might have been moved beyond domestic borders. Their passports had been flagged, their biometric data uploaded to global databases. Jonah arranged for facial recognition software to be deployed across airport footage, border surveillance, and private institution locks. David constructed an algorithm that scanned video feeds for gait analysis, comparing posture, stride, and motion to archived clips of the boys. Miriam returned to the lake one final time that month, standing at the dock with the weight of every moment lived since the day her sons vanished pressing against her shoulders. The water looked the same, unmoved, infinite. But beneath it had been secrets. And beyond it, somewhere, were answers still waiting to surface. 1 week after the whistleblower video surfaced, the federal task force expanded their scope to include embassies, refugee intake centers, and private medical institutions across 3 continents where records showed minor patients admitted without guardianship under provisional identities. Miriam spent every waking hour in the archive room David had built, now a living organism of its own, wires strung across monitors, walls lined with charts and maps, photographs pinned in rows, strings of data spilling across corkboards like rivers of memory. Each day brought new fragments, new names, vague sightings, partial matches. None were confirmed. Yet Miriam did not break. She continued to filter every photo, voice sample, and document through the one question that had anchored her from the beginning. Would her sons still remember who they were if everything else had been taken from them? That question had kept her moving, even as her voice cracked from hours of silent reading, even as her fingers shook with exhaustion over each new search string. Jonah and David operated on parallel tracks, reaching out to darknet journalists, closed network human rights advocates, any node that might intersect with the trail they had uncovered. Then came the alert. A video clip captured at a silent protest in Warsaw 3 months earlier surfaced on a European human rights archive, submitted by a bystander who had recorded the crowd during a peaceful demonstration against border detentions. In the 34th second of the clip, a face turned briefly toward the camera. It was a fleeting moment, 3 frames at most. But the structure of the cheekbones, the set of the eyes, the way the boy's mouth moved as he whispered to someone beside him, it matched Eli's gait signature and biometric profile with a 94% confidence rating. David froze the frame and overlaid it with a childhood photo. The resemblance was haunting. The image was sent to the federal team, who worked through the night to identify protest attendees using local footage and crowd analysis. 48 hours later, they had a name. The boy in the video was listed as Eliev Ben-Na, age 19, with temporary refugee status issued 6 months earlier. His papers were incomplete, his entry log spotty. He had arrived at a border checkpoint near Ukraine with another young man identified only as M, claiming no surviving relatives, no history, and no formal documents except a letter in Hebrew containing 2 words, "We remember." The embassy staff had translated the note and filed it with other anomalies, but no action was taken at the time due to the volume of displacements occurring across the region. When contacted, the center listed in his file confirmed that Eliev had since left their facility, traveling south with a volunteer group assisting with displaced youth. That group had no formal registration, only a loosely managed route through small towns in Romania and northern Greece. Miriam was informed by the agency, but she already knew. It was him. Eli had found a way out. Or perhaps someone had helped him escape. Either way, he was alive, and he was looking for something. Or someone. Miriam insisted on traveling to Europe. The federal team debated, citing safety concerns and the risks of tipping off anyone still involved with the network. Jonah argued on her behalf. In the end, they agreed to a controlled operation. Miriam would travel under an alias with protective escorts and meet with a trusted liaison in Warsaw who had experience locating displaced minors through informal networks. Within 4 days, she stood in the same square where the video had been taken. She scanned the crowd, not for answers, but for echoes. She met with local organizers, showed them the still image, asked about anyone who remembered the 2 boys who moved together, quiet, precise, polite. One organizer recalled a youth who fit the description staying for a week in a nearby hostel run by a retired teacher. They called her and arranged a meeting. The woman, Sophia, answered the door with a cat in her arms and tired eyes behind thick glasses. She welcomed Miriam inside and listened closely as she described the years of searching. Sophia nodded slowly, then went to a drawer and pulled out a small notebook. Inside were names of every person who had passed through her home. On the second page was written Eliev and M, beside their names, a date, and a word, Torah. Miriam blinked, her mind whirring. She asked Sophia if the boys had left anything behind. Sophia said they had taken only what they came with, but one night she had found Eliev reading a worn piece of paper, whispering under his breath. She had recognized a prayer and asked where he learned it. He told her his brother used to recite it to him before sleeping. It was the Shema. Miriam covered her face, tears brimming. It was the same prayer she had whispered through the door the night before they vanished. Sophia offered one last clue. Eliev had spoken about the sea. He had said the next place was where sky meets water, and where he hoped to find silence that listened. Miriam and Jonah followed that thread to Thessaloniki, where a coastal center had registered 2 unaccompanied young men matching the general description. They had volunteered there for 2 weeks before leaving abruptly. But one of the center's workers, a photographer, had captured a group portrait of all volunteers before they left. Miriam was handed the photo. There he was, Eli, standing beside a boy with darker hair, slightly shorter, hand resting on Eli's shoulder. Asher. Her breath caught. The photo was dated just 5 days earlier. They were close, closer than ever. The federal team organized a real-time search through surveillance, bus stations, coastal ferries. One lead came from a market vendor who remembered 2 boys speaking English with a Hebrew accent, asking about ferry routes to the islands. They narrowed the search to 3 ports. Jonah and Miriam traveled to the closest one, arriving just as the late ferry returned. People streamed off the ramp in clusters. Miriam stood silently, scanning each face. Then she saw them. 2 boys stepping onto the dock, moving cautiously, their eyes darting in instinctual patterns. Eli turned slightly, as if sensing her gaze. Their eyes met. There was a pause. Then Asher stepped forward, grabbing his brother's sleeve, following his gaze. Miriam took 1 step, then another. Eli's mouth opened, a question forming in silence. Asher's hand trembled. And then, all at once, they ran. Toward her, arms outstretched. No hesitation. No fear. Just memory, recognition, and the sound of home. The reunion happened in a blur of motion and breath, a moment Miriam had imagined 1,000 ways, but never quite like this. Eli and Asher reached her with arms that were both familiar and foreign, bodies shaped by years she had not witnessed, faces etched with lines too deep for their age. They did not speak at first. They simply held her, and she held them. The three of them locked together in a silence far louder than words. Around them, the ferry dock bustled with the rhythm of travelers and waves. But to Miriam, the world had narrowed to the feel of her son's hearts beating against hers. She could feel the weight of time in their shoulders, the caution in their movements, the way they scanned their surroundings even while clinging to her. They had survived something vast, something that changed the way they moved through space, something that taught them to watch, to wait, to question. And yet, here they were, present, breathing, real. She whispered their names, not for them to hear, but for herself, grounding the moment in something tangible. The days that followed were cautious. The federal team escorted them to a safe location, a neutral space where doctors and psychologists could begin gentle assessments, where the brothers could rest without pressure, where Jonah and David and Miriam could begin to understand the shape of their story. Eli spoke first. His voice was low, hesitant, often stopping mid-thought, as if unsure whether the words were safe to say aloud. He remembered the facility beneath the school, the move through the tunnel, the strange rooms where lights buzzed and adults asked questions in even tones. He remembered being told they were chosen, that their knowledge made them dangerous, that forgetting would keep them safe. He remembered sessions where they were shown images that flickered too fast to see, and how he had written notes at night in case his mind began to blur. Asher was quieter. He leaned on his brother, nodded during the sessions, but spoke only when alone with Miriam. He remembered less in detail, but more in feeling. He described the taste of metal in the air, the way the walls seemed to hum at night, the songs Eli sang softly when the silence became too loud. It became clear that they had been moved multiple times, sometimes together, sometimes apart, always returned to each other when they complied. Their names had been stripped from them, replaced with codes or numbers. But through it all, they had shared a silent language. They had never forgotten their prayers, never forgotten the feel of their mother's voice at bedtime, never forgotten the word remember. It was the word they etched into their belongings, the word they whispered through vents, the word that shaped their sense of time. Remember. In the weeks that followed, details emerged that filled in the outline of the system they had escaped. There were at least 6 facilities across 3 countries. Children were taken under various pretexts, all rooted in isolation and intellectual profiling. Some were returned, altered. Some remained hidden. The Lior Foundation dissolved within days of exposure. Its financial trails were scrubbed, its operators disappeared. Some arrests were made. Most were not. But the system was broken, its methods exposed, its future shattered. Miriam did not ask for revenge. She asked for protection, not just for her sons, but for every child caught in the silence that others called behavioral difference. She worked with trauma experts to develop guidelines for identifying signs of institutional grooming. She wrote letters to every school district in her state, then to others. She testified in closed hearings, not with fury but with precision, always ending with the same sentence: "We cannot lose them again." David converted the archive into a public resource, stripping names, keeping only methods, timelines, recovery patterns. Jonah released a full series on the story, not to shock, but to educate, weaving a narrative of resilience that did not glamorize the pain, but honored the survival. Eli and Asher began therapy in small steps, not to erase what happened, but to understand it, to place it in a framework that did not define them by what was done to them, but by what they chose to hold on to. They asked about school, about faith, about returning to a place that was not watching them. Asher started sketching again. Eli began writing short reflections. They never once used the word home, but they folded their laundry the same way they used to, asked for the same songs at dinner, and walked the same quiet loop around the block, as if retracing a memory they had kept alive in sleep. One morning, Miriam found them sitting on the back porch in the early light, sharing a piece of toast, whispering in that half-sung cadence only siblings use. She stood in the doorway, watching, listening, not interrupting. It occurred to her that rescue is not a moment, but a process. It is not the ferry dock or the courtroom or the headline. It is the sound of laughter returning like a tentative guest. It is the feel of bare feet on the kitchen floor. It is the space between question and answer where someone chooses to speak. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the roofline and shadows stretched across the lawn, Asher came to her and placed a folded note on the table. It was a drawing of a tunnel with light at one end and two figures walking toward it. On the back, he had written a line from the Shema. You shall teach them diligently to your children. Miriam placed the note beside Eli's old journal, now preserved in a climate-safe case. She did not weep. She simply sat with it, the way one sits beside an open window in spring, not because the air is perfect, but because the silence is finally listening. If this story moved you, consider liking and subscribing for more real-life, inspired mysteries. What do you think happened during those missing years? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We read every one.